One missile detected, altitude suborbital, speed over 20,000 kilometers per hour, time to impact 15 minutes, then another, and another. 5 total. Soviet early warning satellites confirmed multiple launches from deep inside the United States. The system allowed only 200 seconds for confirmation. Beyond that, the response was automatic, retaliatory strike, total war. Ground radar showed nothing. Communications from radar command were delayed, no second confirmation. And the man sitting inside Serpukhov 15 was alone. No one else in the bunker had clearance to override the satellite network. He had no evidence, just a red screen. His headset was dead. Command line cold. Procedure said confirm and escalate. But the protocol forbade waiting. The manual forbade silence. 5 blips, 5 trajectories, 5 simulated extinction vectors. No radar echo, no atmospheric tracking, no visible proof, and no one to ask. The doctrine was clear. The satellites were trusted. His hesitation was not. He was never supposed to say no. This happened in the Soviet Union in the year 1983, inside a secret bunker codenamed Serpukhov 15. During a live missile alert drill that wasn't a drill, inside the Soviet High Command, confidence wasn't a weakness. It was the architecture. The belief that the Americans would never strike first was not an assumption. It was doctrine. Generals spoke of it with certainty. Analysts modeled it with mathematics. The Politburo believed that no capitalist leader would risk full annihilation without provocation. In the war rooms of Moscow, the Western fear of mutual destruction was considered absolute. The idea of a first strike, especially from deep in the American homeland, without a single ground movement in Europe, was viewed as paranoid fantasy. When early warning systems were tested, many officers rolled their eyes. When drills simulated nuclear launches, some joked about cowboy nerves. The satellite system was believed to be accurate, but theoretical. It had never seen a real American launch. It had never needed to. The idea was simple if the Americans were going to strike. The first signs would come from Europe. NATO forces moving, submarines repositioning, diplomats fleeing. There would be political noise, not a clean, silent launch of 5 missiles from a continent away. And that's why, when the alarm went off in the early hours of September 26, 1983, no one outside the bunker was ready. The satellites reported it. The screen turned red. The doctrine said, escalate. But the people who had built that doctrine were asleep, fully convinced the Americans weren't suicidal. No direct order had been issued to launch on first sight. But everyone knew the expectation. If the system says missiles are coming, the system is right. Inside Serpukhov 15, that meant the officer on duty wasn't supposed to question it. He was supposed to follow the manual. And the manual was built by men who believed that logic would protect the world. They were wrong. Soviet nuclear doctrine was designed for speed, not debate. The architecture of launch response relied on one core sequence: detect, confirm, retaliate. The key word was confirm. In theory, no missile would ever be launched based on satellite data alone. The warning system, known as OKO, relied on infrared sensors in orbit that could detect the heat signature of American ICBM launches. But confirmation required a second signal from ground-based radar. Without both, no launch order would be triggered. This rule was considered inviolable. It existed to prevent overreaction, to make sure a single glitch didn't end the world. But the system had a weakness. The gap between satellite detection and ground radar confirmation was time. If a launch came from the American Midwest, it would take over 10 minutes before Soviet ground radar could detect it over the horizon. That meant for those 10 minutes, the only data available came from space. The satellites would see the fire, the missiles would already be in the air, and the Soviet Union would be waiting to see if the radar confirmed it in time. The danger wasn't that the data would be ignored. The danger was that the clock wouldn't wait. To compensate, the Soviets built pressure into the system. The officer in charge of Serpukhov 15 had 2 minutes to respond. He could classify the alert as false, or escalate it to high command, which would begin the process of preparing a full nuclear counterstrike. The expectation was clear: act fast, trust the system. The software didn't show probability. It showed red. It said launch detected. The man in the chair wasn't supposed to doubt it. But there was another layer. The Soviets believed that a true American first strike would come in force, hundreds of missiles, not a handful. The scenario where only a few were launched was seen as unrealistic. Either the US would go all in or not at all. That assumption fed into the belief that 5 missiles didn't make sense. But the doctrine didn't account for strategy changes, for decapitation strikes, for limited first salvos designed to paralyze before escalation. The system didn't ask questions. It just triggered alerts. And in 1983, during a year of extreme Cold War tension, the doctrine that required 2 confirmations was about to face its first real test without the radar, without precedent, and without time to think. At 0:14 hours Moscow time, the screen at Serpukhov 15 changed color. The automated alert system had detected what appeared to be the launch of a single American intercontinental ballistic missile. The signal came from one of the OKO satellites in Molniya orbit, watching the central United States. The system displayed the detection in red launch trajectory, estimated velocity, projected impact. But no ground radar confirmed it. The Earth-based network remained silent. This was unusual, but not yet catastrophic. Operators logged the event. The officer in charge, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, initiated the verification procedure. Standard protocol required patience, but 60 seconds later, the system showed a second missile, then a third. By 0:17, 5 separate launches were displayed on the monitor, each independently confirmed by the satellite's infrared sensors. Still, ground radar saw nothing. The system was escalating the threat in real time. 5 missiles from deep inside the US, likely launched from silos in Montana or North Dakota. Their arcs suggested they were inbound to Soviet leadership centers. Petrov had less than 2 minutes left. The logic of the system was clear. Multiple launches confirmed by satellite equals strategic strike. The doctrine was written around that assumption. If he passed the alert up the chain, within 60 seconds, Soviet forces would begin mobilizing for full nuclear retaliation. Missile crews would be put on standby. Strategic bombers would start their engines. Submarine orders would be decoded. There was no partial alert. Once the process began, there would be no safe way to halt it. But Petrov hesitated. He reviewed the data again. The satellite confirmed heat signatures. The system insisted it was correct. But nothing about the pattern made sense. 5 missiles. A true first strike would have launched hundreds. This looked like a fragment, a test, or a mistake. But the machine didn't think that way. It wasn't built to consider motives. It was built to detect infrared exhaust and signal red. And now it had done that 5 times. Petrov looked at the line that connected him to the Soviet General Staff. All he had to do was confirm what the system was showing. That was his only job. That was the rule. But he knew what would come next. And the radar still showed nothing. The sky remained quiet. So he broke the protocol. He marked the alert as a false alarm. He lied. And then he waited. Inside the upper echelons of Soviet command, no one wanted to hear the word error, especially not from a system built for the highest stakes scenario in human history. When the Serpukhov 15 officer withheld the alert, that silence alone was enough to trigger concern. The communication delay itself became the signal. In the logic of Cold War paranoia, not confirming an alert was just as suspicious as confirming it. Analysts at the Central Command Center began questioning whether the system had been disabled, compromised, or overridden. Some assumed NATO electronic warfare had blinded Soviet radar arrays. Others feared an infiltration event, an internal act of sabotage. But no one wanted to say the satellite might be wrong. It wasn't supposed to be wrong. The OKO network was built at extraordinary cost and secrecy. It was calibrated against known American missile launch profiles, with the most advanced Soviet infrared sensors ever placed in orbit. To suggest it had triggered on a false signal would mean the entire first strike warning system had a blind spot. It would call into question every piece of strategic policy built since the early 1970s. So the operating assumption hardened the launch was real. The lack of radar confirmation was the anomaly, not the satellite alert. Briefings reflected that thinking. No one wanted to be the one who dismissed a real attack as a glitch. In that moment, Petrov's decision was not viewed as calm judgment. It was viewed as deviation. He was told to submit a written report on why the alert had been flagged as false. It was treated with bureaucratic coldness, not urgency. Superiors assumed the system had functioned, and the officer had hesitated. The assumption was simple if it said 5 missiles were in the sky. They were, until they weren't. And nothing fell. And nothing exploded. And the sky stayed empty. Before the silence could be explained, it was feared. Within minutes of the alert appearing on the screens at Serpukhov 15, the dominant theory emerged, not from evidence, but from Cold War imagination. 5 missiles, no radar, no further salvos. It didn't match the model of total war, but it did fit a new nightmare, a decapitation strike. The concept had circulated within Soviet strategic circles for years, a limited, high-precision nuclear attack aimed not at cities or air bases, but at leadership. 1 warhead for the general staff, 1 for the Kremlin, 1 for command bunkers, 1 for strategic comm nodes, the last for retaliation delay facilities, a surgical strike to behead command and paralyze response. In 1983, with tensions peaking after NATO's Able Archer exercises and Ronald Reagan's evil empire rhetoric, Soviet planners genuinely feared that the U.S. might try to disable Soviet launch authority in a single coordinated blow. If that happened, there would be no warning, no declaration, just silence and fire. That fear gave oxygen to the theory that the alert wasn't a glitch, but a deliberate strategy. 5 warheads were enough, they argued, if they hit the right targets. Within minutes, internal analysts began drafting impact scenarios, estimated casualty maps, continuity of government protocols. It was all simulated in silence, under red lights and concrete ceilings. No one questioned how strange it was that 5 American ICBMs could be launched without a single ground radar station catching them. The desire to prepare overpowered the obligation to doubt. Inside the bunker, Petrov still waited. No explosion, no seismic event, no radio blackout. Still, the idea of decapitation lingered longer than the warning itself, and in many ways, it was more dangerous than the detection because it gave fear a structure, a logic, a shape. When ground radar failed to confirm the incoming missiles, a more aggressive explanation took hold, one that didn't question the satellite, but blamed the enemy. The theory was immediate and confident. NATO had jammed Soviet radar. It wasn't a malfunction. It was deception. High-frequency noise, electronic countermeasures, a coordinated attempt to blind early warning systems while American missiles crossed into the upper atmosphere. That idea wasn't just plausible. It had been rehearsed in secret briefings for years. Soviet doctrine considered NATO electronic warfare a serious threat. To some officers, the silence of the radar stations wasn't evidence of peace. It was the prelude to war. The scenario took shape quickly. American stealth bombers could have crossed into radar coverage zones, jamming stations just long enough to mask the launch arcs. Submarines in the Arctic could be flooding bandwidth. Satellites might be feeding corrupted telemetry. The lack of a radar echo didn't disprove a strike. It could mean the enemy had simply gotten better at hiding it. In a closed system built on distrust, the simplest answer sensor error was the least acceptable. As reports moved upward, this second theory began to dominate conversations in closed command channels. If radar couldn't see the missiles, it was because the enemy had engineered it that way. And if that was true, then the strike was already underway and response time was vanishing. No officer wanted to be the one who hesitated in the face of a real attack. No one wanted to be remembered as the man who doubted the system and lost the country. What they didn't know, what no one could know that night, was that nothing had been launched. There was no jamming, no stealth, no silence before fire, just a mistake, refracted through fear, moving toward momentum in the days that followed. Once it became clear no American missiles had been launched, Soviet analysts began dissecting the event. They reviewed satellite data, atmospheric logs, orbital geometry, and telemetry timestamps. And slowly, the real explanation emerged not from a spy, not from radar, but from sunlight. On September 26, 1983, at the precise moment, the OKO satellite detected what it interpreted as a missile launch. The sun was aligned just below the horizon of the American Midwest. High-altitude clouds, specifically cirrus formations, made of ice crystals, reflected solar rays upward into the sensor's field of view. The satellite's infrared detectors, tuned to register the heat signatures of missile exhaust, mistook that specific angle and reflection as the thermal bloom of a launch. It had never happened before. No one had tested the system under that exact condition. No one even considered that atmospheric optics could create a phantom ICBM. The OKO system had been designed under the assumption that space-based sensors could see clearly. That assumption ignored the complexity of Earth's atmosphere, its scattering behavior, its reflective bands, and its unpredictability during equinox events. Soviet intelligence had not developed a protocol for such misreads because the system wasn't supposed to require interpretation. The satellite didn't calculate probabilities. It didn't ask questions. It detected a pattern and declared a threat. There were warnings in technical memos written years earlier. A few engineers noted that Molniya orbits might produce awkward sun angles, but those warnings were buried beneath program deadlines, political pressure, and Cold War urgency. The KGB, which oversaw much of the satellite program's internal security, was more concerned with leaks than limitations. The GRU, focused on real-time threat tracking, assumed atmospheric anomalies would be corrected by human review. But no human ever saw the warning before it was triggered. Petrov had been the only layer between detection and retaliation. There was no artificial intelligence in the loop. There was no algorithmic failsafe, just a man, a monitor, and a decision no protocol allowed. The intelligence community learned this lesson in silence. No public report, no systemic audit, internally. However, the impact was clear. Dozens of changes were made quietly over the following months, adjustments to IR filters, revised thresholds for launch detection, and a new guideline that required radar confirmation even under urgent alerts. But the core system remained. The blind spot had been acknowledged, but not fixed. Because the real failure wasn't technological. It was the belief that the system could not fail. OKO was never meant to make decisions. It was meant to warn. The name itself, OKO, means eye in Russian, and that's exactly what it was. A space-based observer, designed to detect the flash of American missile launches from above the clouds. It consisted of a constellation of satellites placed in Molniya orbits elongated, highly elliptical trajectories that allowed each satellite to spend most of its time watching the northern hemisphere. These orbits gave the Soviet Union persistent coverage of American missile fields across the Great Plains. At any given time, at least one OKO satellite had a line-of-sight view of U.S. launch zones. Each satellite carried an infrared detection array calibrated to pick up the thermal signature of rocket launches. The sensors weren't looking for physical objects. They were looking for heat. Specifically, the sudden, intense spike in infrared radiation that accompanies the ignition of an intercontinental ballistic missile. That spike was distinctive. It rose fast, peaked high, and came from a specific part of the atmosphere. The software on board the satellite was programmed to recognize that curve, and only that curve. The system worked, in theory. During tests, it had successfully detected launches of Soviet test rockets. It was fast, automated, and unfiltered by political delay. But that same speed was also its flaw. There was no time for interpretation, no time for nuance. The satellite didn't ask if the heat was caused by a rocket, or a reflection, or an anomaly. It asked only one question: did the light curve match the launch profile? If yes, trigger alert. If not, ignore. On September 26th, the sensor saw 5 sequential flashes, each separated by just enough time to appear as independent missile events. The system assumed the worst. It sent a full alert to Serpukhov 15. From there, the logic tree narrowed. The OKO system passed its detection directly to the command console. It displayed red warnings on the screen. It showed estimated launch coordinates, expected trajectories, and countdown to impact markers. It lit the room with urgency, and then it waited for a human to respond. That human was Stanislav Petrov. He was the duty officer on shift that night, part of a small group of mid-level military personnel tasked with monitoring OKO's feed and making one binary decision: escalate or suppress. If escalated, the alert would pass to the Soviet General Staff, triggering the first steps in nuclear retaliation. If suppressed, the system would continue monitoring and eventually reset. But there was no middle ground. Petrov had 2 minutes. What saved the world that night was not a new piece of hardware or a last-second override. It was Petrov's instinct. He knew the system. He had helped test parts of it, and he knew that 5 missiles didn't make sense. A real American first strike would come in hundreds. Even if it were a decapitation attempt, 5 warheads wouldn't guarantee a crippling blow. Something felt wrong. He also noticed a pattern. All 5 launches had been detected from the same orbital position of the satellite, the same angle, the same sunlit corridor. That suggested a systemic glitch, not a real attack. But the system didn't allow that kind of thinking. It had no room for doubt, just detection and response. Petrov made the decision the machine could not. He marked the alert as a malfunction, even though he had no proof. He lied in the log. He violated procedure, and he waited. No missiles appeared on ground radar. No flashes lit the sky, and slowly, the system returned to green. Later, analysis confirmed the truth. Atmospheric conditions had conspired to produce a false signal. The high-altitude clouds, positioned precisely between the American planes and the satellite, had caught the light of the rising sun and reflected it upward into the satellite's sensors. That reflection mimicked the thermal bloom of missile launches. It had never happened before, and never been predicted. The system had been blind to its own vulnerability. The OKO satellites had no atmospheric filtering, no contextual analysis, no ability to compare different sensor angles, no AI, no triangulation, only light, curve, match, alert. In the months that followed, Soviet engineers revised the calibration protocols. They lowered the sensitivity. They added geometric correction factors. But none of that mattered on the night it happened. In that moment, the system worked as designed, And that was the problem. Because OKO wasn't built to interpret reality. It was built to react to the shadow of war. And if one man hadn't disobeyed it, the system would have passed that shadow straight to the missile silos. When the sun rose over Moscow on September 27th, there was no crater, no smoke, no ruin. There were no missiles in the sky, no calls to retaliate, no emergency broadcast. The system reset. The alert cleared. The night faded into paperwork. And yet, what had nearly happened was never mentioned publicly, not in news reports, not in party briefings, not even in official records. The man who stopped it, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, did not receive a medal. He did not receive a ceremony. He received a quiet reprimand for failing to follow proper reporting protocol. In his report, he had not confirmed the system alert. He had failed to pass the warning upward. He had, in bureaucratic terms, frozen under pressure. That narrative held. His file was quietly marked. He was not promoted. He was not reassigned. He was sidelined. In private, his commanders acknowledged the possibility that he had prevented a catastrophe. But in official language, that possibility couldn't exist, because admitting it meant admitting the system had failed. And if OKO had failed once, it could fail again. So the incident was buried, classified under standard review procedures, its details sealed even from senior analysts. The system was deemed functional with margin, nothing more. Petrov returned to a normal post. His uniform remained plain. His name did not appear in the records of heroism. He retired quietly. Years later, when interviewed by foreign journalists, he spoke without bitterness. "I was just doing my job," he said. But the job he had been given was not to think. It was to respond. And he had disobeyed that expectation. The true humiliation was not Petrov's, it was the system's, a billion-ruble satellite network. The pride of Soviet strategic defense had mistaken sunlight for missiles, and only a single man, half forgotten, had stood between mistake and apocalypse. He didn't do it with equipment. He didn't do it with training. He did it by hesitating, by thinking, and the world never knew. The doctrine that governed the Soviet nuclear response was not designed to allow hesitation. It was built around certainty. Certainty that machines could see what humans could not. Certainty that systems would detect what politics could not predict. And certainty that, when the time came, a chain of command would carry out retaliation with no emotion, no debate, no delay. That certainty was supposed to prevent war. It was supposed to make decisions automatic, remove fear, remove impulse. But on September 26, 1983, that logic unraveled, because one man broke it. Stanislav Petrov didn't override a launch order. He never received one. What he did was far more dangerous to the system. He refused to follow the very premise of that system. He looked at a red screen, at confirmed satellite data, and said, no, he didn't trust the numbers. He didn't trust the process. He trusted what wasn't their absence. No radar, no seismic activity, no communications blackout. He saw a system screaming in red, and he chose silence instead. That was not an act of sabotage. It was not treason. It was rational defiance of blind logic, and it broke the illusion that the system was infallible. For decades, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had structured nuclear doctrine around the concept of second strike survivability. If you were attacked, you would respond automatically, with enough force to ensure mutual destruction. But that theory rested on a fragile faith in machines, a faith that detection meant certainty, that blinking lights meant the end of doubt. Petrov revealed the lie in that logic. He proved that survival might depend not on automation, but on a single, disobedient thought. After 1983, Soviet officials began to quietly acknowledge the danger. New systems were designed to include multiple data streams. Cross-checks were required. Delays were introduced, not long ones, but just long enough to let a human question the machine. In the West, analysts only learned the full story years later. But when they did, it changed their own assumptions. The American strategy of launch on warning, once considered essential, began to fade. The belief that machines could provide certainty in a world of chaos had been cracked, because for one night, the machine told the man the world was ending, and the man said, no. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017, alone, in a quiet Moscow suburb. His apartment was modest. His phone rarely rang. For decades, almost no one knew his name. He was never celebrated by the state. He did not appear in military parades. His uniform remained locked in a closet. And yet, for a few minutes in 1983, the weight of the world rested in his hand, not as a metaphor, but as a line on a console, blinking red, waiting for a confirmation code. He had no orders, no precedent, no second voice in the room. All he had was silence and the terrifying knowledge that his decision would either stop nothing or stop everything. There is no statue for Stanislav Petrov, no holiday in his name. But there is a console, still buried deep in a decommissioned bunker south of Moscow. Dust covers the monitors now. The keypad no longer glows, but the cables remain. The chair still sits facing the wall of screens, and the memory of that night lives in the unmarked logs of a system that almost ended everything. Not with a missile, not with a warhead, but with a reflection of sunlight, mistaken for extinction. He waited. He disobeyed protocol. He chose doubt over duty. And for that, we're still here.